Dr. Richard L. Cravatts is the author of Dispatches from the War Against Israel and Jews. He is a leading authority on academic anti-Semitism and Israel hatred. He has published over 500 articles, op-ed pieces, columns, and book chapters on campus anti-Semitism, anti-Israelism, higher education, campus free speech, terrorism, constitutional law, Middle East politics, and social policy in such publications as the New York Times, Newsweek, Chicago Tribune, Wall Street Journal, Times of Israel, and many other leading publications around the world. Dr. Cravatts is President Emeritus and a board member of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, a faculty network of some 40,000 academics on more than 3,200 campuses worldwide. He also holds board positions at the Florida chapter of ZOA, the Journal for the Study of Antisemitism, AMCHA Initiative, Endowment for Middle East Truth, Israel Alliance, and the Louis Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. It is my great honor and privilege to welcome Dr. Richard Cravatts.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation from the Gross Family Foundation.
Richard, take the mic out. You told us I can't hear you. There you go.
I appreciate invitations when I'm asked to speak, but of course, the topic of my speeches is so profound and saddening that it's never a joyous time. I'll speak for half an hour or so, and I want to take you through a 30,000-foot look at what's going on university campuses. The perception of Israel that we'll be speaking about today is only the way Israel is perceived and talked about on campuses, not anything to do with the reality of Israel's politics or facts on the ground, but only in the way that Israel is perceived by the enemies of Israel. And that's the topic of our conversation today. And I want to illustrate through posters and speeches and books and academic pseudoscience and pseudo-research how Israel is manipulated into a false narrative about what it represents and how it shows itself to the world and expresses Western values. Many of you may be familiar with the great Melanie Phillips' book, The World Turned Upside Down. And I like to use that title as a theme for what we're going to be speaking about today, because Phillips talks about how in Britain the Western cultures and values have been subsumed by Islamism and values that are antithetical to Western thought and traditions. And nowhere is the world turned upside down more apparent and relevant than what's going on university campuses with respect to how Israel is perceived and treated and studied. You see a poster that I have on my opening slide from Israel Apartheid Week, which started in Toronto. And I think in many ways this typifies the way that Israel has been characterized and how its enemies wanted to be seen, how the activists on campus routinely, promiscuously, and relentlessly demonize, slander, and attack Israel for what it is in their minds, in order for it to be made a pariah among nations, so that when we talk about Israel on campuses, we are talking, as Melanie Phillips put it, in a dialogue of the demented, nonsense about reality, the world turned upside down. So in this particular poster, you see a depiction that is very characteristic of many of the tropes and symbols that we'll see in the talk today, where Israel is depicted as an Apache helicopter. It's inhuman. It has no human characteristics. It's a piece of military machinery. And not only that, it is not only inhuman, but it is murderous. And you see that, that the Arabs and the Palestinian cause is depicted as an innocent child holding a teddy bear that is about to be murdered by Israeli IDF forces, who are not even human in this picture. And the whole scene is surrounded by an encampment that looks like a prison camp or a concentration camp. So this narrative of the militaristic, subhuman, murderous Israeli is a trope that's repeated in many different respects. And you'll see that it has evolved in a way that Israel is made into the new Nazis, which is a profoundly grotesque notion that my colleague Richard Landis calls moral sadism. The idea that the Jews, who themselves were the victims of the Third Reich, are now being accused of being Nazis themselves, is another perverse inversion of reality, a type of Holocaust inversion, where Israel is made into the new Nazis and the innocent Palestinians are the new Jews who are being exterminated in a genocide against them perpetrated by the apartheid, racist, colonial regime of Israel, which wishes to destroy them. In England, there's a company that does a semi-annual brand index of nations. You all know what a brand is. I teach marketing, and in marketing, we try to establish a brand image for a product. It's a shortcut that consumers know what the brand represents, what it stands for, what they can expect from it. Countries also brand themselves and want themselves to be seen in a way that attracts tourism and business and investment from people overseas. And this company does a brand index of countries by which they have tens of thousands of consumers complete surveys in which they evaluate a number of countries to rate the appeal of those countries based on their perception of it. How friendly it seems, how modern it seems, would you like to live there, and so forth. And isn't it interesting that Israel, a Western-style democracy with a free press, an open society, a judiciary that's fair and honest, a exploding economy that's rivaling America in terms of biotech and medical technology, ends up at the bottom of these lists, below China and Yemen and North Korea. How's that even possible? What's going on here that's giving Israel this type of brand identity? What has happened that a country that has such positive values and features and is a democracy in a sea of authoritarian regimes is perceived to be at the bottom of a list of desirable countries? What's going on here? So how does Israel brand itself? Well, it brands itself like all countries do. It tries to make its strengths known to its potential consumers and tourists and business owners and other interests and stakeholders that have an interest in settling into Israel or visiting there. So here you see, for example, a cover spread that was done in Maxim magazine to try to get young people to have a more favorable image of Israel by having women of the IDF do beauty shots. And you have other tourism promotional magazine ads and so forth to try to depict Israel in a way that it actually is, the way that Israel wants to be seen, because this is the way Israel is. But how is Israel actually perceived? It's perceived in a way that is in this notion of the world turned upside down, that reality is inverted, that a false narrative has been created that Israel is a place of oppression, of brutality, of usurped land, of racism, of apartheid, of genocide against the poor Palestinians who are, of course, innocent. This idea that Israel is somehow the brutal oppressor, of course, is a way that Israel and its history have been turned on its head, where Israel was a pluckish little David going against a Goliath of Arab nations, clinging on to survival by the thinnest of threads, and has managed to thrive. But how have the enemies of Israel been successful in depicting what Israel is about? Here you see the same theme of a tank representing Israel. Again, no human aspect to it. It's a militaristic, mechanistic, brutal, deadly piece of machinery representing Israel, and the Arabs and the Palestinian cause is represented as a boy throwing a stone against the might of the brutal military oppressor of Israel. And here you see on the other slide the young Palestinian at a checkpoint going through the humiliation of checkpoints. Well, of course, absent in that conversation, absent is any context about why there would be checkpoints. Why did Israel have to build the so-called apartheid wall, which is actually a fence for about 80% of it? But the wall was built not as a racist wall to separate white European Jews from brown-colored Arabs. It was built as a way of stopping murderous psychopaths from killing Israelis because they were Jews. And in fact, the so-called apartheid wall has been successful in reducing terrorism by 80%. But to the enemies of Israel, to the people turning this narrative on its head, this is an apartheid wall that symbolizes Israel's fundamental racism and inability to live with its Arab neighbors, and its inclination to subjugate an indigenous people to oppression, racism, apartheid, and militaristic rule. Irwin Cutler is the very humble and wise former member of Parliament who now runs the Wallenberg Center in Canada. And he made an interesting observation that I thought is very relevant to our talk today. He said that in the 20th century, the worst charge that you could make against somebody was that they were racist. That if you made the racism charge, it was the worst allegation you could make against somebody. And where were racism most profoundly manifested in the 20th century? In Nazism and in apartheid. And isn't it interesting, as you'll see throughout our talk today, that Israel is relentlessly accused of both being a racist apartheid regime and a perpetrator of racism against indigenous brown people, as if the Jews suddenly showed up in the Holy Land after World War II and without any previous connection to the land. This is another part of the narrative that's perpetrated by the enemies of Israel, because if you can dilute the Jewish attachment to Jerusalem and what is now Israel, you of course make the Arab claim stronger. And this is a way of minimizing Israel's attachment to the land and legitimacy, at the same time elevating the legitimacy of the Palestinian claim. So what's going on campuses that makes campuses these cauldrons of hatred and activism against Israel? You know, in the general population, as you can see from our recent elections, even going back to Obama and Clinton and Bush, and in the latest election, the country is almost split 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals. And students go to campuses without a lot of without a lot of preconceived notions, politically speaking. But if we look at university campuses and the breakdown of the ideology of university professors, if we're in the business school and the hard sciences and the stem cell areas and disciplines, we see that the ratio of self-described liberals to conservatives, it may be 3 to 1. But if we go into the humanities and sociology, English, anthropology, Middle East studies, and other humanity disciplines, the ratios go 28 to 1 liberals to conservatives. 28 to 1. Now, who cares, you could say? Why does that matter? Because liberals on campuses, liberal professors, are the ones that are the faculty sponsors for anti-Israel groups. Liberals on campus tend to favor the oppressed, the minority groups, the identity politics that are going on campuses. And Israel now, Zionism, pro-Israel students, pro-Israel professors are seen to be right-wing conservatives, anti-progressive, and even considered to be white. So the breakdown and difference between liberals and conservatives is another reason why students are drawn into being compassionate towards and feeling an affinity for the Palestinian cause, because they perceive Israel to be like America, an imperialistic power that has deprived an indigenous oppressed people with their rights and has subjugated them in a way that liberals find to be disheartening and unacceptable. Some of you are familiar with the working definitions that have been developed, and the current popular one is from the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. This working definition has been adopted by many university campuses and many organizations now as a way of helping administrators and people identify what the new anti-Semitism is. The old anti-Semitism was fairly easy to identify because it was specifically a hatred and distaste of Jews. And that classic anti-Semitism is no longer fashionable. And it's the type of anti-Semitism that has kind of slithered out of sight and has disappeared from polite society. And once in a while it will expose itself. But on university campuses, the new anti-Semitism is more pernicious. Why? Because it is wrapped up and relies on a hatred of the Jewish state as the new representative of Jew. So that if you detest Israel, if you despise Zionism, if you attack the Jewish state, that is a convenient and polite way of actually hating Jews. But you are being anti-Semitic. If you only deny Jews the right to self-determination of all people on earth, that in fact, by the standards of this definition, is a form of anti-Semitism. And so university administrators have been having a difficult time in characterizing the activities and behavior and speech and academic output of some of these anti-Israel individuals and groups on campuses, because they either naively or cleverly say, well, that's just criticism of Israel, that's not anti-Semitism. But in fact, if you are relentlessly anti-Zionist, if you only obsess about Israel and hold Israel to a standard that no other country is held to, if you deny only Jews the right to self-determination while saying that Palestinian self-determination, for example, is perfectly appropriate, that in fact is anti-Semitism. And we want college administrators and faculty and other individuals who want to protect Jewish students from this furtive new form of anti-Semitism to be protected. And we want to be able, when groups and individuals are actually acting in an anti-Semitic manner by attacking Zionism and Israel, to be called out for it. Now, of course, progressive groups like Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now and J Street and other pro-Palestinian groups have denounced this definition. They say that it's going to chill their free speech. They don't like the fact that they're going to be called anti-Semitic because they say that we are trying to suppress their Palestinian solidarity, when in fact we want to call out their behavior for what it is. We don't care if they want to be anti-Semitic, but we don't want them to be able to get away with it. And henceforth, because of a working definition like this, we will be able to label their behavior for what it really is and call it out. If they want to continue with that behavior, that's fine. But they're not going to be able to get away with it by just saying, well, we're just being critical of Israel, that's all. This has nothing to do with hating Jews, when we all know that that's not true. On university campuses today, the primary promoter of the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is the chief campaign against Zionism, against Israel, against the Jewish self-determination that's manifested in Israel, is an organization called Students for Justice in Palestine. They're on over 200 campuses around the country, and they have become the modern brown shirts of anti-Israel agitation on campuses. They promote every student resolution to urge their respective universities to divest from Israel. Every year in March or April, they have Israeli Apartheid Week, which lasts for an entire week, and where they construct a mock apartheid wall and have demonstrations denouncing Jews, denouncing Israel, denouncing Zionism, shouting down pro-Israel speakers that come to campus, shouting down pro-Israel events sponsored by Jewish kids on their respective campuses. On Holocaust Memorial Days, these groups will come on campus and disrupt the activities, making all Jews, irrespective of whether they support Israel or not, complicit in the oppression of the Palestinians and so forth. So this group is a toxic, repulsive group. Only one school in the United States has been successful in having them defunded as a student organization. That was Fordham University. So Students for Justice in Palestine asked Fordham to make it a recognized student group. And a wise dean there said, looking at their history, no, because I know what you do. I know what you represent. And I know that your constant and sole focus is on attacking Israel. And that's going to be disruptive to the Fordham campus. Well, the student group took Fordham to court, and they actually won the case, but it was recently reversed. But I thought it was a glimmer of light for those of us who are wondering why a group like this is allowed to even exist on campus. Imagine, if you will, that a white power group, a white supremacist group, or the Ku Klux Klan, or Westboro Baptist Church, or any group like that tried to set up a student organization. There would be no chance in hell that that would ever be approved by any university in America. There would be no white power professor on any university campus on America. So all of this talk by progressives about the rise of white supremacy on campus as the chief source of anti-Semitism is a delusion and a lie, and it's a way of distracting from the true anti-Semitism that's being driven by left-wing activists, student groups like Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace and others that are promoting and weaponizing this hatred towards Israel in a way that makes Jewish students feel uncomfortable on their campuses. We've also noticed through research done by the AMCA initiative, on whose board I sit, that campuses that have a strong Students for Justice in Palestine chapter have many more incidents of actual anti-Semitism. Swastikas, mezuzahs torn off the wall, anti-Jewish sentiment, anti-Jewish speech, and so forth. So the presence of these groups is not only toxic, but it has a harmful and cumulative effect on Jewish students as well, and makes their presence on campus troublesome, to put it mildly. Listen to this short.
I want to be known that we here in Berkeley support the Intifada. Intifada, Intifada, we support the Intifada.
Intifada, we support the Intifada.
Intifada, Intifada.
Intifada.
Intifada, Intifada, we support the 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 Intifada.
Let the people of Palestine hear you. Free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Free,
Free
free
Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
End the occupation now.
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 From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free.
From the river to the sea, Palestine.
Netanyahu, what do you say? How many kids have you killed today?
Netanyahu, what do you say? How many kids have you killed today? Intifada, Intifada, we support the Intifada.
Intifada, Intifada, we support the Intifada. No justice!
No peace!
No justice!
No peace!
No justice!
What's going on there?
No justice!
The reason I wanted to show you that is not because of the brilliance of the chanting. Imagine, if you will, that there was a group on campus yelling, string them up, send them back to Africa, or build a wall, send those wetbacks back to Mexico, or kill them, string them up, kill them. The universities would go apoplectic. Here you have students on an American campus yelling, Intifada, Intifada, long live Intifada. What does that mean? The Intifada means the uprising where 1,000 Israelis were murdered in the first Intifada and 12,000 injured. So here you have American kids on an American campus screaming for the murder of Jews on behalf of Palestinian self-determination. So what are they saying? That Palestinian cause is so noble and so wonderful that it's worth and they are willing to have Jews murdered on behalf of Palestinian self-determination? It's outrageous. And the fact that these students, if you ask them, would think that they are the most tolerant and progressive and open-hearted students on the entire campus because they care for the underdog, and here they are calling for the murder of another people. It's outrageous that they do this without any self-awareness. And I find it to be very telling about the progressive cause, which is not atypical of what communism did in the 20th century, murdering 100 million people in the cause of this brave new world. Well, this is the same thing, where you're willing to exterminate one people to make the oppressed, happy. To raise the oppressed, you have to murder the oppressors, and that's perfectly acceptable. That's what they're calling for here. The other lie here, part of the narrative, is free, free Palestine. Palestine will be free. There was no country called Palestine. There's no country called Palestine that's going to be liberated so that the Palestinians can return to what was their country. That's a lie. There was a territory called Palestine, and it was a place known for being the home of the Jews, not of the Palestinians, who were invented in the 1960s. But the idea that that these activists want Palestine, this fictitious nation, to be liberated from the Jews, and that from the river, the Jordan River, to the Mediterranean Sea, Palestine will be free. What does that phrase mean? That means no more Israel. If Palestine is free from the river to the sea, that means that Israel will be destroyed, that the Jewish state will be annihilated, that the Jews there, if necessary, will be murdered in the Intifada, so that the Palestinians can once again liberate Palestine and return to what were their homes. It's all, of course, lies, but it shows you how deadly and deranged and dangerous this lie is. You also saw them chanting about Zionism being equal to racism. This is something that started in the United Nations in the 1970s, as you know, where they declared that Zionism was a form of racism. But it's resurrected periodically by these activists on campus who like this. And so it's easy for progressive students and anti-Israel students to not want any form of Zionism to be on campuses. And what we saw during the Trump years was that Zionism started being equated to white supremacy, that Jews who supported Israel are now perceived to be white, that they're not in the bucket with Muslims and blacks and other minority groups. They're perceived to be white, and therefore they can more easily be put into the box of racist oppressors. Martin Kramer wrote this book a while back, over a decade ago, where he evaluated Middle Eastern studies departments and what was going on there. What I'm showing you today is how Israel suffers the death by 1,000 cuts. So we're looking at some of the 1,000 cuts, and it's coming from many different directions. Some of it, as we just saw, comes from student groups, but it's also coming from faculty. And the danger of academic anti-Semitism, the hatred of Israel by academia, is dangerous because academics have credibility. Academics are believed. And Middle Eastern studies departments, for example, at Columbia University, which is dealt with in this book, and which I have a whole chapter in my book about, Columbia University's Department of Middle Eastern Studies is an anti-Israel, anti-Western, anti-American, anti-colonial hotbed of radical professors, 95% of whom have an anti-Western, anti-Israel approach to Middle Eastern studies. Martin Kramer called them tenured radicals because they were hired not because they were academically qualified, but because they were ideologues that had politicized scholarship in a way to demean and libel Israel and to excuse Arab regimes and totalitarian countries in the Middle East from the predations of their own societies, from the offenses that they have perpetrated. And if we look at Georgetown University, for example, and their Middle Eastern Studies program run by John Esposito, he's taken tens of millions of dollars of Gulf state money and Arab money and Saudi money to fund his programs. Well, what happens if he's taking tens of millions of dollars to fund academic programs? Do you think he's going to have a balanced dialogue about Israel and the surrounding countries? Do you think the speakers who come to speak there and the professors that are given endowed chairs and the conferences that they hold are going to be balanced in a way that fairly portrays Israel and that doesn't excuse terrorism and radical Islam and the other maladies that infect the Muslim world and are part of what Israel is fighting for the West and for all of us by remaining as a beacon of hope against that totalitarian imperialism of Islam? Of course not. So Middle Eastern studies is important, as I said, because Columbia and Georgetown and Harvard and Berkeley and other schools of that nature that have Middle Eastern studies programs and who sponsor these programs are not rinky-dink universities in Mississippi and Alabama. They're the beacons of the Ivy League, where the professors who teach there have great influence with diplomats and Washington and in the academic world, and have, by that respect, credibility in a way that endangers Israel's reputation. The way that faculty write, of course, influences the way that the world perceives Israel too. And this kind of scholarly or pseudo-scholarly output also gives ammunition to student groups like SJP when they're making their attacks against Israel. I'm sure most of you in the room are familiar with the Israel Lobby book that came out about 10 or 12 years ago. Now, what's the danger of this book? Well, Alan Dershowitz and I wrote pieces attacking this book when it came out because we considered it to be a modern version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Walt and Mearsheimer in this book make the case that because Israel is so well treated by America, and in their view, that's against American interests and shouldn't be that way because it's caused us to be alienated from much of the world because we've been a constant friend to Israel. They said, well, how did this happen? Why should we be a friend of Israel, and how did we end up supporting Israel with money and congressional support and so forth when it's not in our best interest? What's their answer? Well, there's a powerful, hidden, secretive, manipulative cabal of Jewish organizations and individuals and interests working against the interest of the United States itself for the benefit of Israel. That's the oldest anti-Semitic trope there is, that Jews control things behind the scenes, that they make wars, that they do things for their own interest and profit. And here you have a professor from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard and the University of Chicago dressed up in Brooks Brothers suits from the Ivy League perpetrating an anti-Semitic trope that Jews are behind the scene helping Israel against American interests. This book became a bestseller at the same time that the authors were claiming that their views were being suppressed by Jewish-controlled media because they didn't want the truth to get out. The other book was a master's thesis by Nadia Abu al-Hajj, who was a Barnard professor. This book is a book supposedly about archaeology in Israel and Jerusalem, although the author is not an archaeologist. She's a pro-Palestinian ideologue and political promoter. What does this book purport? She did a study of Israeli archaeology, and she accused Israeli archaeologists, who of course, because of where they are and what they do, are the most scrupulous and careful in the world probably. She accused them of finding only those remnants of history which made the case that there was any Jewish presence in the Holy Land in olden times. Why did she do this? For the reason that I stated earlier. Because if you could debase the Jewish claim to Israel and Palestine, that area of Palestine, and elevate the Palestinian claim, it weakens the Jewish claim to the legitimacy of the Israeli state. And it emboldens the Palestinian side to say, we deserve this because we were here first. So she said that Israeli archaeologists invented a history of Jews and the Holy Land. It shows you the debasement of scholarship in, on campuses today, another phenomenon that we see, which indirectly affects Israel and Jewish students, is this concept of intersectionality. Intersectionality is the view that all oppressed groups share an affinity because they are oppressed. And so what that means on campuses is that progressive movements of gay students and Muslim students and Latino students and all other minority groups share an affinity because they all feel oppressed by the majority culture. so that they're against white supremacy, they're against Zionism, they're against heteronormative sexuality, they're against white males who oppress them. Whatever their oppressors are, they're kind of joining a big club. And what this means for anti-Israel agitation on campuses is that Students for Justice in Palestine will frequently recruit the support of black groups and gay groups and other progressive groups to support anti-Israel resolutions in student governments and so forth. And Jewish students, if they are visible Zionists, if they are visibly pro-Israel, will not be allowed to be part of this intersectionality. They are expelled now from progressive causes, which is another way that kind of latent and benign anti-Semitism is affecting Jewish students, whether or not they even support Israel, but only for the reason that they are Jewish and not considered to be a minority group, that they're now considered to be white and not deserving of protection. And as I mentioned earlier, one phenomenon that we saw after Trump was elected, that the left, because of Charlottesville, which of course was not exactly a truthful representation of what Trump or most Republicans stand for, but because of Charlottesville and the misrepresentation of what Trump said, and because of Steve Bannon's involvement, the whole Trump administration and therefore Republicans in general were accused, as you know, of being white supremacists or enabling white supremacists or emboldening white supremacists and so forth. And since Zionism now is looked at as a type of white supremacy because, as I told you, Jews are now white, and because Zionism is racism, this is another example of white Jewish supremacy. So this current fad of alleging that there's white supremacists everywhere in universities, in the White House, and in government has seeped into the anti-Israel rhetoric as well. And you see it here in one, on one particular campus at the University of Illinois, where you were smashing white supremacy and Zionism with the same club, meaning that they had been kind of merged in people's minds. As another indication of the world turned upside down, I wanted to show you two indications of academic malfeasance, if you will, in a way that shows you the mental gymnastics that people will go to malign Israel. So the concept of pinkwashing was written about prominently first in the New York Times by a professor, Sarah Schulman. Pinkwashing was this idea that, in her mind, Israel is known for having a very good record on gay rights. They have gay pride parades in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem, and gays can be openly gay in Israel, where as if someone was openly gay in Gaza, they would end up being dragged behind a car on a rope or hung in Iran by a crane. But Israel is gay-friendly and has a reputation for this and is known for it and promotes it in its tourism materials. Why is Israel gay-friendly? Why do they promote it? Well, according to this brilliant professor, it's not because they're actually good people. It's not because they think that people should have the right to express their sexuality in whatever way that they want. No. Israel is being underhanded. They're sneaky. They're pretending to say that they're in favor of gay rights, but they're only doing this to obscure their sins against the Palestinians, that they're pinkwashing their oppression of the Palestinians, that they're pretending to be good people by supporting gays, only to make you forget about how racist, oppressive, militaristic, and murderous they are to the poor Palestinians. That's pinkwashing. That shows you the mental gymnastics that people will go to slander Israel. Here's another beautiful example. This woman writes a master's thesis at Hebrew University in Israel. and she's trying to trace the incidence of rape by the IDF against Arab women. So in many military conflicts, she had found, and other historians and writers had found, that the soldiers of one force will rape the women of the opponent's force. So she does a huge study of rape in the IDF of Arab women and finds there's an incredibly low incidence of it. That would be good, wouldn't it? In a normal world, in a world that was not turned upside down, that would be a wonderful thing. Oh no. The reason that there's no rape by the IDF of Arab women is because the IDF is so racist that they won't lower themselves to rape Arab women. This is the world turned upside down. She won a prize for this thesis in Israel by progressives who said, see how bad we are, that we can even expose our own sins. But this isn't scholarship. This is something else. This is the politicization of scholarship to prove a point, to make a point. Jasbir Puar is another wonderful Rutgers professor, wrote a book published by Duke University Press, which is now known for publishing the work of anti-Semites and Israel haters. And she said that Israel has a strategy, a deliberate strategy by the soldiers of Israel to maim, debilitate, and injure the Palestinians by shooting, starving, hurting them physically, hitting them with rubber bullets as a way of subjugating an indigenous population. This is a book by Duke University Press in which basically accuses an entire country of strategically maiming and harming another people for their own purposes of oppression and suppression of an indigenous people. Outrageous. Published in a book. And she gives lectures on this and is invited by university departments to talk about her book. University departments sponsor them, and nobody in the room stands up and says, are you kidding? First of all, she made most of her research up. It's not even based on facts. But to weave this in, this attack on Israel's moral depravity and the allegation that an entire country strategically maims and hurts another people for the purposes of controlling them is such a perverse and grotesque inversion of the truth that it's hard to believe that it's taken seriously, but it is. How are we doing on time? 2 minutes? Here's another example of how Israel is made to be blamed for ills going on in entirely different countries. At Tufts University recently, Students for Justice in Palestine, that wonderful anti-Israel group that I described to you earlier, wanted to have the Tufts University police fired. And they found out that one of the policemen had gone to Israel for training on crowd control and terrorism, because the IDF, because of their history, has become very adept at handling terrorism and crowd control and other things that can be of use to American police forces. So some American police forces have sent people to be trained by Israel on techniques of counterterrorism and so forth. How has that been described, though, by anti-Israel activists? They call it the Deadly Exchange Program. And how it's come back is that now Israel is accused of training American police how to murder black people in America. So that the techniques of the IDF that are being taught to American policemen, it is said, are only being taught so that American policemen will know how to kill black people like they killed George Floyd. In fact, there's posters of a IDF soldier sitting on the neck of a Palestinian in the same way that that policeman in Minneapolis was on the neck of George Floyd, to draw the similarity, to show that there's a joining of Israeli grotesque behavior with what's going on in the black community with white policemen. It's, of course, the whole narrative about blacks being randomly and promiscuously being murdered by white policemen is itself a myth. But the idea that the IDF is now responsible for black people being killed by white policemen is, of course, a horrible inversion. And yet another way that Israel is made to be the world's worst purveyor of brutality, murder, immorality, and every other human excess.
I'd like to thank Dr. Cravatts for coming. We don't have a second mic, but we're going to take a few questions from the audience, but no statements, no monologues, just questions, please. So if you have a question, gentlemen.
Thank you.